whispering void. It was an old house, crumbling at the edges and swallowed by the forest that grew wild around it. The locals called it the Hollow House, but they spoke of it only in whispers, as if uttering the name too loudly might draw its attention. For decades, the Hollow House stood abandoned, its once bright windows now gaping like hollow eyes. But everyone knew the stories. Stories of the strange sounds that carried from its depths, of the faces glimpsed in the shattered glass, of the people who went inside and were never seen again. Mara, a journalist who chased ghost stories and the unexplained, had heard them all. She thrived on skepticism, believing every legend had a logical explanation. But when she heard about the Hollow House, something inside her itched to investigate. The townsfolk warned her, but their warnings only fueled her curiosity. On a foggy autumn evening, she stood before the house, its silhouette looming like a black stain against the sky. The air was heavy and still, pressing down like unseen hands. As she stepped closer, the chill grew deeper, unnatural, as if the house itself breathed cold. The door, hanging loose on its hinges, creaked open with a mournful wail. Mara paused at the threshold, a flashlight in her hand. She took a breath, her breath clouding the air, and crossed into the darkness. The floorboards groaned under her weight, echoing in the emptiness. Dust motes swirled in the flashlight beam as she scanned the foyer. Her footsteps crunched on shattered glass and the brittle remains of forgotten things. The house seemed to sigh around her, an exhalation of decay. She moved deeper, past rooms filled with shadows that shifted and curled like smoke. Her breath quickened, but she pressed on. She was here for the truth. She was here to prove that the Hollow House was nothing more than a rotting structure with a reputation inflated by time and fear. Then she heard it, a faint whisper, almost too quiet to be real. She turned sharply, shining her light toward the sound, but there was nothing there, just darkness. The whisper came again, closer now, like a breath against her ear. "Come closer," it seemed to say, though she couldn't make out the words. The voice was neither male nor female, neither young nor old. It was like a chorus of voices, all speaking in unison, all speaking from deep within the walls. Mara's heart pounded, but she kept moving, her curiosity outweighing her fear. She followed the sound up the narrow staircase, each step creaking beneath her weight. At the top, a long hallway stretched out, lined with doors that led to unseen rooms. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. "Come closer, closer!" A door at the end of the hall stood ajar. Pale moonlight streamed through a crack, casting a thin line on the warped floorboards. The whispers came from inside, 1,000 voices speaking at once, overlapping, calling her name now. "Mara! Mara!" She swallowed hard and pushed the door open. The room was empty, save for a large old mirror propped against the far wall. Its surface was cracked, and its frame was dark with age. The whispers were louder here, rising to a frantic pitch, like a swarm of bees inside her skull. The flashlight flickered, and for a moment she saw them, faces in the mirror, dozens of them, all staring at her with wide, hollow eyes. They were pale and gaunt, their mouths moving in silent pleas. Mara's breath caught in her throat. She blinked, and the faces were gone. The whispering ceased. Silence filled the room, thick and suffocating. Mara stared at the mirror, unable to tear her gaze away. She could see her own reflection now, but something was wrong. Her reflection was smiling. She wasn't. The smile widened, stretching too far, too unnatural. Then the reflection's lips moved, forming words that she couldn't hear, but she could understand. "Come closer." Mara felt a pull, a compulsion she couldn't resist. She took a step toward the mirror, then another. Her mind screamed to stop, to turn back, but her body betrayed her. Her hand reached out, fingers brushing the cold, cracked glass. The surface rippled like water, and suddenly her hand was inside. She tried to pull back, but an unseen force held her fast. Panic surged through her veins. She watched as her reflection's smile twisted into a grotesque grin. And then it spoke. Its voice no longer a whisper, but a deafening roar in her mind. "You should not have come here." With a violent jerk, the mirror pulled her in. She felt herself falling, spiraling into darkness, deeper and deeper, until she was swallowed whole by the void. The mirror's surface stilled, and for a moment there was nothing. Then, slowly, a new reflection appeared. Mara, standing in the room, her face serene, her smile wide. She turned, walked to the door, and disappeared into the darkness of the Hollow House. and the whispering began again. Outside, the fog thickened, wrapping the hollow house in a shroud of silence. The locals say if you stand very still on a quiet night, you can still hear the whispers. But no one goes close enough to listen. The Endless Hallway. Edgar had always been a skeptic, a professor of psychology who specialized in debunking the supernatural. Ghosts, monsters, and curses were all just manifestations of the human psyche, he believed, fears brought to life by the mind. So when he was invited to investigate Blackwood Manor, he accepted eagerly. It was said to be one of the most haunted places in the country, and Edgar was ready to prove it was all nonsense. The manor stood on the outskirts of a forgotten town, hidden deep in the woods where the light barely touched the ground. It was a monstrous structure, its tall, narrow windows like black, unblinking eyes. The front door was heavy and ancient, the kind that groaned and shuddered as if dreading what lay beyond. Edgar entered with a recorder and a notebook, taking detailed notes on the architecture, the atmosphere, the cold that seeped through the walls. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional creak of wood settling. Dust hung in the air like mist, disturbed only by his breath. He began his exploration in the foyer, moving through room after room, each more decrepit than the last. Faded wallpaper peeled away in ragged strips, and the furniture lay rotting, its dark shapes slumped and twisted. Cobwebs clung to every corner like silent sentinels, and the floorboards groaned beneath his steps as if whispering secrets from the past. Hours passed as he moved deeper into the house. He felt a growing unease, a prickling at the back of his neck. It wasn't fear, he told himself, but a natural reaction to the oppressive surroundings. Then he found the hallway. It was long, impossibly long. At first, Edgar thought it was a trick of the light, a perspective illusion caused by the darkness and the way the walls seemed to close in. But the further he walked, the longer it stretched. The hallway seemed to go on forever, lined with closed doors that looked identical. He glanced back the way he had come, but the foyer was no longer visible. Only the endless hallway stretched behind him as well. He felt a chill run down his spine, colder than the air around him. He shook it off, determined to keep moving. He tried the first door to his right. It opened with a reluctant groan, revealing a small, empty room with a single window. He could see the trees outside, but they were dead, their branches gnarled like skeletal fingers. He closed the door and opened the next one. It led to another room, almost identical, but the window showed only darkness. No trees, no sky, just an infinite black void. Edgar's hand trembled as he shut the door and moved to the next. Room after room, door after door, they were all the same. The darkness outside grew deeper, swallowing the world beyond. Panic began to claw at his rational mind. He turned and hurried back down the hall, but no matter how far he walked, the hallway stretched on. The doors watched him like eyes, and the floor creaked beneath his frantic steps. Sweat trickled down his temples, and his breath came in ragged gasps. He tried one of the doors again. This time, the room was different. It was filled with mirrors, dozens of them, all cracked and dusty. In each one, he saw his own reflection, but there was something wrong with his face. His eyes were wide, wild, his mouth twisted into a silent scream that he hadn't made. He stumbled back, slamming the door shut. The hallway seemed darker now, the shadows deeper and more alive. He walked faster, his footsteps echoing around him. He tried another door and another, each room more distorted than the last. One room had no floor, only a black abyss that seemed to suck in all the light. Another had walls that seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting like lungs. Edgar's heart pounded in his chest. His rational mind began to crack under the weight of the impossible. He shouted, called for help, but his voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence. He turned again, running now, his footsteps a frantic rhythm against the ancient wood. The doors seemed to multiply, stretching further and further away. Then he heard it, a sound that froze his blood. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, echoing his own, but from somewhere ahead of him. They grew louder, closer, but he saw no one. The hairs on his neck stood on end, and he backed away, his breath hitching in his throat. The footsteps stopped, and in the sudden silence, he heard a whisper. It was soft, almost inaudible, like a breath against his ear. Turn around. Edgar's eyes widened. He wanted to run. to bolt down the hallway until his legs gave out, but something compelled him to obey. Slowly he turned. At the far end of the hall, he saw a figure, a shadow, barely distinguishable from the darkness around it. It stood still, too still, its head tilted as if watching him. The whisper came again, louder this time, and he realized it wasn't a whisper at all. It was a thought, a voice inside his mind that wasn't his own. Come closer. He couldn't move, his legs frozen in place, but the figure began to glide toward him. Its form remained indistinct, shifting as if it were made of the darkness itself. As it neared, the temperature dropped, and Edgar could see his breath misting in the air. Come closer, the voice repeated, insistent, commanding. Edgar took a step back, and the figure halted. The air grew heavy, pressing down on his chest. His heart thundered in his ears. He wanted to look away, but his eyes were locked on the shadow as it began to move again, its presence growing colder, more oppressive. He took another step back, then another, until he was running. The hallway stretched endlessly ahead, and the figure behind him glided faster, almost floating over the floor. Its whisper grew into a cacophony, echoing in his mind, drowning out his thoughts. Closer, closer. He didn't know how long he ran. Minutes? Hours? Time seemed to warp in the endless corridor. His legs burned, his lungs ached, but he couldn't stop. The figure was always just behind him, its presence gnawing at his sanity. Finally, he reached a door that felt different. There was a flickering light beneath it, and he grasped the handle with desperate hope. He flung it open and stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind him. The room was lit by a single, swinging bulb. His eyes adjusted, and he saw the walls were covered in pictures. Hundreds of them, all of people staring into the camera with wide, terrified eyes. Some were old, yellowed with age, while others looked freshly taken. And in the center of the room, he saw a mirror. His reflection stared back at him, but it wasn't him. The eyes were too wide, the grin too sharp, and then it spoke, its voice a whisper that slithered through his mind like a snake. "You've finally come closer." The light flickered, and everything went black. When the townspeople found Blackwood Manor months later, they discovered Edgar's notebook at the threshold of the endless hallway. His last entry was a single scrawled sentence: "Don't follow the footsteps." The house on Ashwick Lane. Every town has that one house, the one that everyone knows about but no one dares to speak of too loudly. In the sleepy town of Millhaven, that house was on Ashwick Lane. It was an ancient, sagging Victorian with a crooked turret and boarded-up windows that seemed to stare accusingly at anyone who dared pass by. The townsfolk called it the Ashwick House, but to the kids it was always the Devil's Doorway. Legend had it that, on Halloween night, the house came alive. They said it fed on fear, that it lured people in with whispered promises of dares and candy, then devoured them whole. None of the children who dared to venture inside on Halloween ever returned. But 13-year-old Tommy and his friends, Danny, Sarah, and Lily, weren't like the others. They weren't afraid of ghost stories. It was Halloween, and they wanted a real scare. They decided to prove that the Devil's Doorway was just another rundown house with a bad reputation. As dusk fell, they stood at the rusted gate, staring up at the house. A full moon peeked through the dark clouds, casting twisted shadows over the gnarled trees that surrounded the property. The wind howled through the skeletal branches like a chorus of the dead. "Just an old house," Tommy muttered, trying to convince himself as much as the others. He pushed the gate open with a loud, rusted creak that seemed to echo far too long, like something deep within the house had heard them coming. They walked up the cracked path, each step crunching on dead leaves. The air was thick with decay, the scent of damp wood and something else. Something sour, like old blood. Tommy reached the door first and turned to the others with a grin that barely masked his nerves. "Ready?" Danny, trying to look brave, nodded. Sarah swallowed hard, her eyes darting around the shadows. Lily, the quietest of the group, stared at the door, her face pale but determined. Tommy twisted the old brass knob and pushed. The door opened with a groan that sounded almost like a low moan of pain. Inside, the house was pitch black, the air musty and stale. A cold breeze slithered out, wrapping around them like icy fingers. "After you," Danny said with a shaky laugh, pushing Tommy forward. They stepped inside, the wooden floorboards creaking under their weight. The door slammed shut behind them with a deafening bang, and they all jumped, hearts pounding. "Just the wind," Tommy whispered, but no one believed him. They clicked on their flashlights, the beams piercing the darkness and revealing a long, narrow hallway. The wallpaper was peeling away, revealing dark, moldy wood underneath. Strange symbols were etched into the walls, deep, jagged gouges that looked like claw marks. As they moved deeper into the house, the temperature seemed to drop, their breath visible in the cold air. Every step echoed like a gunshot, and the house seemed to shift around them, groaning and creaking, as if it were stretching after a long sleep. They found themselves in a parlor, the air thick with dust. An old, moth-eaten sofa and a few shattered chairs were scattered around. A grand fireplace stood at one end, filled with charred, crumbling bones. "Probably just animal bones," Sarah muttered, but her voice trembled. A low whisper suddenly drifted through the room, like a breeze carrying a distant conversation. "Do you hear that?" Lily asked, her voice barely more than a breath. They nodded, their eyes darting around. The whispering grew louder, though they couldn't make out any words. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, rising and falling, an unintelligible chorus of voices. Then a child's laugh echoed down the hallway, high-pitched, playful, and terribly out of place. They all froze. The laugh came again, this time closer. Sarah's flashlight flickered, and she frantically smacked it with her hand until it steadied. "We should leave," Lily whispered, her eyes wide. "Just a little further," Tommy insisted, though his voice wavered. He wasn't about to turn back now, not after dragging everyone here. They continued down the hall, the whispering growing louder, almost like chanting now. The wallpaper was more torn here, the symbols more frequent, claw marks deeper. They reached a staircase that spiraled up into darkness. "Let's go up," Tommy said, leading the way. The stairs groaned under their weight, dust falling in clouds from the banister. At the top was a landing with several closed doors. One of them was slightly ajar, a dim, flickering light coming from within. "Who else would be here?" Danny asked, his voice barely more than a whimper. "No one," Sarah replied. "No one lives here." Tommy pushed the door open. The room was a nursery, an old crib in the corner, a rocking chair swaying gently as if someone had just been sitting in it. An old oil lamp flickered on a small table, though none of them had lit it. The whispers were deafening now, a chaotic blend of voices and tones that filled their heads with static. Tommy turned to say something to the others, but his words caught in his throat. Behind them, in the doorway, stood a figure, a tall, gaunt man with hollow eyes that seemed to drink in the light. His skin was stretched tight over his bones, his mouth a twisted grin filled with far too many teeth. "Run," Tommy managed to choke out, but as he turned to flee, the door slammed shut, and the man stepped forward. The children backed away, pressing against the walls, their eyes wide with terror. The man's grin stretched wider, his eyes never blinking. "Welcome," he hissed, his voice a guttural rasp that seemed to echo from the very walls. The rocking chair began to rock faster on its own, and the crib started to shake violently. The whispers turned to screams, children's screams, and the air grew heavy with the stench of something burning. Lily grabbed Tommy's arm. "We need to get out now," she screamed. They lunged for the door, but it wouldn't budge. The figure was closer now, its limbs twitching unnaturally, its head tilting to an impossible angle. It began to laugh, a deep, rumbling sound that made their skin crawl. Suddenly, the walls began to bleed. Dark, thick rivulets of crimson seeped from the cracks, the symbols carved into the wood glowing with an eerie, malevolent light. Danny screamed, backing into a corner, his eyes wide with horror. Tommy pounded on the door with all his strength. "Let us out," he shouted, but the door held firm. The man was upon them now, his cold, bony fingers reaching out, impossibly long and thin like talons. "Please, let us out." Sarah sobbed, her back against the wall, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispers reached a fever pitch, the screams blending into a hellish cacophony. The man's grin stretched so wide it seemed to split his face in half, revealing rows of jagged teeth. Then, as if by some cruel mercy, the door flew open. They bolted out, racing down the stairs, their footsteps a chaotic drumbeat. The walls seemed to close in on them, the house itself warping, twisting, as if trying to swallow them whole. They burst through the front door, and into the cold night air, not stopping until they were well down Ashwick Lane. They didn't look back. They didn't dare. When they finally stopped, gasping for breath, they turned to see the house. It stood as it always had, silent and still. But in the window of the nursery they saw it. The man, standing there, watching them, his grin stretching wider and wider, his eyes dark and empty. The whispers still haunted their ears, even as they fled. No one ever spoke of what happened that Halloween night at the Ashwick house. But they all knew one thing. The house was alive, and it was hungry. And every Halloween, it waits for someone else to come knocking. The Silent Masquerade. In the small, forgotten town of Ravensmoor, Halloween was more than just a holiday. It was a tradition rooted in an old, chilling legend. The story was about the Ravensmoor Manor, a grand estate that had fallen into ruin, where the dead were said to hold a masquerade ball every Halloween night. It was whispered that those who dared to enter the manor on Halloween would become guests at the Silent Masquerade, a dance from which there was no return. This year, a group of friends, Emma, Michael, Jenna, and Lucas, decided to test the legend. They were all thrill seekers, bored with the usual Halloween festivities and eager for a real scare. The manor stood on the edge of a foggy, desolate hill, its windows shattered and its facade crumbling. It loomed against the night sky like a dark giant, its once grand architecture now a skeletal ghost of its former self. As they approached, the moon hid behind thick clouds, casting the world into near total darkness. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and rotting wood. Emma, the boldest among them, pushed open the iron gate. It screeched like a dying animal, the sound echoing across the empty grounds. "Let's see if the ghosts are ready to party," she joked, though her voice betrayed a hint of nervousness. They stepped inside, the fog curling around their ankles like cold, dead fingers. The front doors of the manor were slightly ajar, as if inviting them in. Lucas hesitated. "Maybe this isn't such a good idea," he said, glancing at the others. "Come on," Jenna replied, trying to sound braver than she felt. "It's just an old house." They pushed the doors open and stepped into the grand foyer. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, and dust hung thick in the beams of their flashlights. An enormous chandelier dangled from the ceiling, its crystals missing, swaying slightly as if touched by an unseen hand. Cobwebs draped over the banisters like tattered veils, and the wallpaper was torn and faded. Suddenly, from somewhere deeper in the house, they heard a faint, distant music, a slow, haunting waltz. It was the sound of an old gramophone, scratchy and distorted, yet unmistakably clear. The friends exchanged uneasy glances. "Someone's just messing with us," Michael whispered, "trying to scare us." But there was no one else there. There couldn't be. Drawn by the eerie melody, they followed the sound down a dark, narrow corridor. The music grew louder, accompanied by the rhythmic creak of floorboards, as if someone, or something, was dancing. They turned a corner and found themselves in a vast ballroom. Their flashlights flickered, and for a moment they could see them, figures clad in extravagant, decayed costumes, moving in slow, deliberate circles. Masks covered their faces, some grotesque, some beautiful, all frozen in wide, eerie smiles. Then the lights went out, and the figures vanished. The music continued, and the friends stood frozen, too terrified to speak. Emma was the first to move. "It's just a trick," she insisted, her voice shaking. "Someone's playing a prank on us." But as she took a step forward, something strange happened. The music grew louder, and suddenly she was spinning, her feet moving against her will. Her eyes widened in horror as she twirled across the floor, an invisible partner leading her in a waltz. "Help me," she cried, her voice breaking. The others tried to reach her, but they were pulled back by an unseen force. Jenna screamed as cold hands gripped her waist, lifting her into a dance. Michael and Lucas tried to pull her away, but they too were swept up in the macabre waltz. The air grew colder, and the room seemed to stretch, the walls moving further and further away. "Stop! Let us go!" Michael shouted, but his voice was lost in the growing chorus of whispers that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. The ballroom came alive with the sounds of unseen dancers, soft laughter, hushed whispers, and footsteps moving in time with the music. The friends were no longer alone. The masked figures had returned, circling around them. The air was thick with the smell of roses, rotten and overpowering. Lucas looked into the eyes of one of the masked dancers, and his blood ran cold. The mask was bone white, with delicate golden accents and hollow black eyes. Beneath the mask, he could see a pair of shriveled lips pulled into an unnatural smile. "This isn't real. This isn't real," he repeated to himself, his voice trembling. But it was real. And as he looked around, he saw that the masked figures weren't masks at all. They were faces, stretched and frozen, their eyes empty voids that stared without seeing. The figures moved closer, their hands cold and skeletal, reaching out. Jenna was pulled away from them, her eyes wide with terror. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her mouth opened in a silent cry, and then her face began to change. Her skin paled, her eyes darkened, and her lips twisted into that same unnatural smile. She turned back to them, a new mask on her face, and began to waltz among the dead. "Jenna!" Michael shouted, but she didn't seem to hear him. She was lost to the dance, her body moving in perfect, unnatural rhythm. Lucas tried to pull Emma back, but she was already fading, her eyes dull, her movements jerky, as if she were a puppet on invisible strings. The masked figures spun around them, their laughter growing louder, blending with the music in a cacophony of madness. Michael grabbed Lucas's arm. "We have to go! Now!" he yelled, but his voice barely pierced through the deafening waltz. They pushed through the crowd of ghostly dancers, the air growing colder and thicker, as if the house itself were breathing them in. They reached the door, but it wouldn't open. The ballroom seemed to close in around them, the walls warping and twisting like living flesh. Emma's laughter echoed behind them, high-pitched and hollow. They turned to see her, her face now fully transformed into one of the masks, her eyes empty. The music swelled, and the air grew unbearably cold. Lucas felt his skin tightening, his limbs growing stiff. "We have to get out," he gasped, but his mouth wouldn't form the words. His eyes darted to Michael, who was staring in horror at his own hands, watching them wither and pale. The masked figures moved closer, and one of them reached out, its touch freezing. Michael's vision blurred, his breath turning to mist. The last thing he saw was Lucas's face, twisting into a grotesque smile. The next morning, the townspeople found the manor's front doors wide open. They found 4 new masks lying in the ballroom, their faces eerily familiar, eyes wide and staring. From that day on, whenever anyone walked past the Ravensmore Manor on Halloween night, they could hear the faint strains of a waltz drifting through the air. And if they listened closely, they could hear the whispers of the new guests at the silent masquerade, forever dancing in the dark.